Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Beards and Cars, for those who are perhaps new to this series, since it has been about 2 weeks since we did the last one, and quite a few new people are here on the channel since then. So basically what we do here is, it's a much more informal setting, where we talk about stuff which doesn't necessarily fall into a organised series, if you will. I mean, it is an organised series, but you know what I mean. It's more informal, you could talk about pretty much whatever. And as always, if there's something that you guys would like to talk about, then you can always slap that down in the comments for the next episode. And one of those things was actually put in well, not last week's episode, but the last episode, and that was talking about defunct or dead, if you will, car classes in racing. In particular, stuff like Group B racing, or Group C racing, or even something more recent like the GT1 or LMP 900 cars. And that is definitely something which I like talking about. It's something which I've spoken about before on the channel. When I do touch on those subjects, it tends to be more about specific cars though, like vehicles that were too good or too advanced for their time. And we've talked about those kind of cars quite a lot on the channel. But in a broader sense, as far as those classes go, I would say that probably one of my favourites there is one of the slightly less appreciated ones, which is the LMP 900 era, which I believe started basically in 1999-ish, maybe 98, but I think it was around 99, and then spanned up until, what, 2003, 2004-ish? Maybe some of them were left over in 2005, that kind of era, but I think it was basically the early 2000s as a general rule. And actually, although it isn't really a category that many people talk about anymore, because it tends to either be the latest and greatest or nostalgia for the Group C era, which, for obvious reasons, they're very cool cars, but the LMP 900s, they tend to fall into that little bit of a conversational no man's land, that people don't really talk about them that much. But some of the cars in that era are actually among my favourites. As I've mentioned before, my favourite racing team in any form of motorsport that they're in is Panoz. I love Panoz as a brand. I love brands which don't or aren't scared to be small, basically. They embrace that and they use it to their best advantage, and that's something which Panoz has always done. They have a lot of innovation for such a small team. They even built Road Atlanta, the racetrack, and they've always had a strong presence in motorsport, the ALMS for instance, and also in the Le Mans. Now, the car that's probably best known to most Gran Turismo players from Panoz would be the GTR1, which is referred to in the game as the Esperante GTR1, but it's actually not really an Esperante, it's just the GTR1. The Esperante is more the road version, which looks nothing like that car. It's a Mustang-powered Porsche 911 rival, which incidentally is probably my favourite sports car, actually. But that aside, Panoz had a pretty strong showing as far as LMP 900s go. They didn't actually win the Le Mans, but they were always among the crowd favourites for fairly obvious reasons. They look like nothing else on the grid. They stand out very much so because, like the Nissan Nismo GTR, they're also front mid-engine rather than traditional mid-engine, in as much as the engine is in front of the driver rather than behind him. Very Batmobile-esque. Personally, I love the Panoz LMP01, which is one of those. It's a front-engine prototype, fantastic-looking machine, kind of like the GTR1 to some degree, but it's an open-top car. Pretty fast, pretty loud with the big American V8. I love that kind of thing. But as well, some of my other favourites in the LMP 900 kind of era were the Chrysler Dallara SP1, a car which I sometimes refer to as the bullnose. It's certainly not a car which many people would say is a good-looking machine, but I love it when you have a company which, they don't necessarily build the car. It tends to be Dallara or Lola or one of those companies, or Courage, who make the chassis, and then it's basically just the branding of a manufacturer slapped onto that, and more often than not they'll provide the engine. So it's not really a Chrysler, but at the same time it's cool to have a car like that from Chrysler, at least as far as I'm concerned. And that's one of the reasons why one of my favourite LMPs, and definitely my favourite LMP 900 car, is actually the Cadillac LMP02, which for one thing is a fantastic looking car, the later shape model in particular, but also because how cool is it to have a Cadillac Le Mans prototype? To me, that's just such a cool concept. It would be like if Rolls-Royce made one. You just don't expect that to happen. Whereas with a company like Bentley, they're in that same kind of area, but at the same time, Bentley isn't like Cadillac and Rolls-Royce in as much as they've always had a strong racing presence, even as far back as the start of the Le Mans. So it's not too surprising that they'd come back, and that when they did well with the Speed 8, which of course is based on the Audi R8, but just has a roof. But those early 2000s cars in particular, I just love the diversity in there, because these days you only hear about the same manufacturers, Peugeot, Audi, Porsche, and kind of Toyota as well, especially in the most recent Le Mans. But back then there was much more diversity, because although Audi was still dominating, you still had some great other teams in there as well, like Panoz, Pescarolo or Pescarolo, however you want to say it, Cadillac, Dallara with the Chrysler, for instance. There was a pretty good selection of teams, and there were also some cars which I'm not certain that they were LMP 900s or not. I think they might not have been, but I can't recall. But there's a car called the Reynard 2KQ, which bore Volkswagen livery. And again, it's not really a Volkswagen, but I just love the fact that you could have a prototype with a Volkswagen badge on it flying around the Le Mans. To me, that just looks so cool to have a Volkswagen prototype. In effect, I've always loved that kind of thing. And that's a car which I'd urge you guys to check out if you haven't heard of it, the Volkswagen Reynard 2KQ. Pretty cool little prototype. I believe it might have been something like an LMP2 equivalent, something like that. I can't recall exactly. I think it was an LMP 900 era vehicle though, around 2001-ish, something like that. Green and blue, I believe the one that I like is. I don't know if there are other versions. But yeah, I love that there was such diversity there. And although there still is, of course, you just don't really tend to hear about it much anymore. It's all of the chatter around Audi, Porsche, Peugeot, Toyota, those same old teams. And the smaller teams just, they don't really even get noticed very much anymore. Whereas like Panoz, for instance, or Pescarolo, they never won. But they were always very competitive and crowd favourites, especially in the case of the Panoz models. I miss that to some degree. That's probably the biggest thing, actually, that I miss about the LMP 900 era, that there was such a wide variety, and all of them were genuinely interesting cars. Whereas these days, maybe it's just me, but to me the prototypes are looking more and more just so similar to each other. And I know there are differences, of course, if you put the cars next to each other, they do look different. And you could even say about Group C cars that so many of them look similar. But, I don't know, maybe it's just nostalgia for me, but those cars look more different to me than they do now. Because, for instance, if you put the Audi e-tron, the Porsche 919, and the Toyota TS40 or TS50 next to each other, they do have differences, but if you took the livery away, they look so similar. Because, of course, the regulations are getting stricter and stricter with the size of the car, the measurements of all the wings and everything. And that's fair enough, if you want to be like the F1, that is, but as many of you guys know, I don't like the F1. And I don't really like touring car racing either for those same reasons. GT class stuff like Blancpain, that is better to me because the cars do genuinely look different. They have to fall within certain performance requirements, but the Bentley GT3 car looks nothing like a BMW Z4 or a Morgan Aero 8 GT3 car. They look so different despite being in the same kind of class, and I will always prefer that. Whereas with touring cars, it doesn't help the fact that all hatchbacks basically look the same these days anyway. The Megane, the Mercedes A-Class, they're all a very similar shape. So as touring cars, they look so similar, and that of course has always been a trademark of touring cars, even in the DTM. Many of them have a very similar shape. As far as Group C cars, there's actually a lot more variation, I think, than there is now. For instance, if you took the livery off of, say, a Peugeot 905, and put that next to a Mazda 787B, and those cars are only 1 year apart, Mazda won in 91, Peugeot won in 92 and 93, so they're very close to each other, but those cars look nothing alike. They are both top-tier prototypes, but they look nothing alike. Now, of course, That's partially due to the fact that the Mazda was basically using a 1980s design, whereas the Peugeot was using a state-of-the-art 90s design, very F1 inspired, along with a couple of other race cars as well. I believe the Allard J2X, I think it was, which had also a very similar pod-style layout to the Peugeot 905, very F1-esque in its design, whereas stuff like the Sauber C9 or the 787B, or even my personal favourite, the R92CP, they had a much more 80s style design. That very, well, endurance sports car design by definition, whereas the cars in the early 90s, they started to move away from that a little bit. And then, of course, through the mid-90s, they really started to branch out. They started to become one of the best eras, I would say, of Le Mans racing, because they went away from just being pure prototypes made just for the Le Mans, and then the rules were changed to make the cars much more production based than they had ever been before. Not that they were road cars, but that there had to be road versions of the cars, and they started to look much more like racing versions of that manufacturer's best known vehicles. For instance, if you take a Sauber C9 or a Mazda 787B or even a Peugeot 905, they were fantastic prototypes. As I said, Mazda won in 91, Mercedes won in 89, Peugeot won in 93 and 92, but they look nothing like any of the cars that you could buy from those companies. There was no Mazda that looked like the 787B. There was no Mercedes that looked like the Sauber C9, and there certainly wasn't a Peugeot that looked like the 905. But then, from around, say, 94-ish, and much more so in 95, up to around 99, you had those cars which had much more closer ties to actual versions sold by the company. Stuff like the Porsche 911 GT1, which looks like a 911. The CLK GTR from Mercedes, which looks like a CLK, but stretched out and made much more extreme. The Lotus Elise GT1, very much so a modified Lotus Elise shape. They had those much closer ties to the available road versions, and in some ways that's cool, in some ways not so much. I do believe that it lost a little bit of the extremeness by doing that. The cars didn't look quite so crazy, but at the same time it gave them this feeling of attainableness, which the Group C cars never really had. They always felt like F1 cars, in as much as you couldn't imagine driving one on the road. Even though sometimes you could. There was a street version of the Porsche 917, for instance, and I believe there's a guy now in Japan who drives a Porsche 962 on the road. And I don't mean the Door 962, which is a great car, I mean an actual Rothmans Porsche 962. He's got it road registered. Whereas with the GT1 cars, there were road-going versions. Even something as out there as the Nissan R390, there was a road version of that. And it's easy to take that for granted, but that's such a cool thing to have cars that extreme. Even though they were rare, more often than not, the Lotus they only made one road version of, Nissan only made one version of each of the R390s. They had the one short-tail red one, and I believe they only made one red one, and then they made the more famous one, which is the single long-tail blue version. Porsche made a few GT1s based on both the 993 and the 996. Personally, I prefer the 993, which is the older one. And then, of course, Mercedes made a few CLK GTRs. I think they made something like 25 of them. So, as far as homologation cars go, it's actually not as rare as some. And then there's the even more exclusive Roadster version of the CLK GTR, which was an entirely unnecessary vehicle because that wasn't to homologate the race car. That was just an offshoot model. And that's actually my favourite version of the CLK GTR, because it's not just the same car with the roof taken off, it is an entirely different vehicle. From every angle it has so many different details, including one of my personal favourite design aspects of any car, which is buttresses behind the headrests. If you can have that on a car, an open top, I think that looks fantastic. Some other cars which have featured that would be stuff like the Porsche 918, which also has that. As I said, the CLK GTR Roadster has it. What other ones have that now? I can't recall at the moment, but that tends to be a very supercar, a very exotic thing to do, to have those buttresses behind the seats on top of the engine bay. Personally, a speedster version of a supercar, which I've always wanted to see with buttresses behind the seats in that CLK GTR style, was the Saleen S7. I would love to see an open-top version of the Saleen S7, but with the centerpiece of a CLK GTR Roadster. I think that would look absolutely fantastic. It does surprise me, actually, that Saleen never made an open-top version. And again, the Saleen S7, and to some degree the Maserati MC12 and that generation in the mid-2000s kind of took the concept of the GT1 cars of the 90s and made it a bit more modern again. But with those cars, they feel much, much closer to the road versions than the 90s cars did. Because, for instance, the 90s CLK GTR race car was still pretty different to the road version. The Porsche 911 GT1, not as much. It does look just like the same car but with livery, but of course underneath it's very different. And then something like a Nissan R390 is completely different visually, much more extreme as the race car with the big wing and the body kit. But then in the mid-2000s era, stuff like the Saleen S7, the MC12, the Mosler MT900, I don't believe that was a GT1 car though, but the same kind of vehicle design. They feel much more like the road version, just with basically a bigger wing. The Saleen, definitely, it looks almost exactly like the road version. And I think that's cool. When you can have a race car that looks like you could just drive it out of the race and then drive it home, McLaren F1 style, I always think that looks cool. At the same time, I've never really been able to understand why some manufacturer doesn't try and make an LMP1 or LMP900 style car in that same train of thought, really. A road-going LMP900 car. To me, that would be awesome. Obviously, it wasn't a requirement of the rules, and that's probably the main reason why they didn't do it, but how cool would it be to have something like a road-going Bentley Speed 8, or a road-going Audi R8? And of course, we do have a road-going Audi R8, but it's nothing like the race car. They didn't need to, and that's the main reason why they didn't do it. And of course you'd have to put it through stuff like more rigorous crash testing. It's not exactly the safest looking of cars in an accident, whereas a GT1 car, it's got more body work, it's a meatier vehicle, it can take more of a crash without being totaled and just crumpled to a crisp. So it's understandable that they didn't do that, but still I would have loved to seen at least one company make a road-going LMP 900 model. And maybe they did, and I haven't heard of it, but I'm not aware of it that I can think of. As far as forgotten rallying, or disbanded rallying, or banned rallying, the one that always stands out is obviously the Group B. It's the most famous of the halted ones, primarily due to safety issues, I believe, the Ford RS200 being a prime culprit. And that's a shame, of course. It gets to live on to some degree in the world of Gran Turismo now. With GT Sport, we've got a number of Group B modern equivalents like the Peugeot RCZ, which looks fantastic as a Group B style vehicle, but with most of those cars they look more like Pikes Peak Specials rather than Group B cars. And the Group B is an awesome category, and actually it has a very similar feel and a similar reason to me to why I love it so much, in as much as those Group B cars, like the 90s GT1s, spawned such awesome road versions. Because, again, of the rules. They had to homologate them for racing, or in this case for rallying, and that led to some of the most iconic retro performance cars of the 80s and 90s. Your Lancia Deltas, your Ford Escort RS Cosworths, your Ford RS200s, a couple of lesser-known ones like the Citroën BX, I think it was, and a couple of those ultra-rare Lada models. Then you got the ones which they were also homologated and they look very similar, but they weren't rally cars, like the Mercedes 190e Evo 2 Cosworth powered, or the Ford RS 500 Sierra. Not necessarily rally cars, but very similar, like a normal boxy road car with flared arches and a bigger wing and more power, generally in the region of 200 to say 250 horsepower, not many of them built. And I've always thought that the 190e looks like it would make a great rally car. Not necessarily exactly the same, but if you made it all-wheel drive and jacked it up a little bit, I think that looks like a Group B machine. But they have that same kind of feel. Of course, they were homologated for touring car racing rather than rallying, but still, they've got that same kind of vibe to it. As far as stuff like the return of Group B, I think returning to that would probably be more difficult with today's safety-conscious motorsports than a return to, say, the Group C era. Because with that kind of tech, modernising a Group C car or a 90s GT1 car wouldn't be too difficult, because the modern LMPs still have many similarities to them. So you could make a modern Group C car. You could definitely make a modern GT1 style machine. I mean, imagine how cool that would be if those rules were brought back and we started having road-going homologated versions of Le Mans cars. Imagine how awesome that would be, especially if it was from, say, Porsche and Toyota and Audi. Especially Porsche and Toyota again, because that would be kind of like a throwback to their 90s road-going versions, like the Toyota TS20 and the Porsche 911 GT1. That would be pretty cool. With Group B, on the other hand, I think they'd have trouble bringing that back. Or you could bring back the name, but the cars definitely wouldn't be as extreme. Because even with the WRC, they are going pretty fast, to say the least, and they've got no way near the power of a Group C, or not a Group C, a Group B rally car. Plus they weigh, more often than not, a lot more. So way back then, especially in, well, the glory days of Group B with the Deltas and the Quattros and all of those monsters, they were powerful, around 450 horsepower, sometimes a bit more, but then you had some absolutely insane creations in, I believe it was the Group S category, stuff like the Lancia ECV1, which was based on the Delta S4, but even more extreme. I can't remember how much power that one had. I think it might have been around 570 horsepower. Bright red, looks fantastic, and that thing could hit 60 in, I think, 1.8 seconds, something like that. It may have even been less. So basically a Pikes Peak car, and I believe some Pikes Peak cars were Group S machines. And then, of course, in the Pikes Peak, you've got some of the craziest and most iconic cars of the Gran Turismo franchise. The Escudo, most notably, but now the Tajima E-Runner as well. You've got the Cultus as well from Gran Turismo 2, which I've always liked more than the Escudo, to be honest. But those cars have managed to remain basically as extreme as they've always been. The Pikes Peak is one of the few places in motorsport, be it road or rally, where they are still as extreme as they used to be. You just don't hear the cars getting as famous now, because of course the Escudo has most of its fame due to Gran Turismo. If it weren't for Gran Turismo, how many people would know about that car? Probably not as many. Whereas something like, say, a modern Pikes Peak car, like the Tajima, that was featured on Gran Turismo, and it's still not talked about as much. Now, of course, not as many people like electric cars, but even some of the ones that run nowadays, which aren't electric, still don't get talked about as much, because, well, actually, I don't know why. People just don't seem to have the same appetite for that. And that's a shame, because for people, it seems more and more as the years pass that they have more of an interest in the drivers and who finishes where and the drama between teams, rather than which car is the best. And I guess to some degree that's always been the case. In the glory days, some would say, of Grand Prix back in Lauda's era, back then it was all about the drivers as well, so I guess it hasn't really changed. I just wish it was more like the 80s and 90s, because I don't really remember any of the primary drivers from the 80s and 90s who won the Le Mans. But what I do remember is the cars, because that's what it was about. Whereas now, it's not really. In the Le Mans now, it's more about the teams. Toyota versus Audi versus Peugeot versus Porsche, and that's cool. I can get behind that. Whereas in the F1, it's almost totally about the drivers now and the drama. I just have no interest in that. But overall, I guess those are my condensed thoughts to some degree about the whole forgotten classes and defunct classes in racing and rallying. There are certainly some which I'd like to see come back, and of course, as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below as well. I know that a lot of you guys do have very specific thoughts, in particular about the Le Mans, some about Grand Prix, F1, not so much about rallying. I don't hear as much chatter about that on the channel, but I know some of you guys do like rallying, Group B, WRC, Pikes Peak, Dakar, for instance. Recently we discussed a car from that. So yeah, I'd love to hear about that down below. And as I said earlier on in the video, if there is something that you'd like to talk about in a future episode, say next week for instance, of course you can slap that down below. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.